we've got Dr. Diana Allen joining us first. Diana is a professor of hydrology in the Department of Earth Sciences at Simon Fraser University. Her research focuses on studying the processes that take place as natural groundwater systems respond to stressors like climate change, developing strategies to assess risks to water security, and ultimately informing decision makers and policies. So without further ado, I'm going to give Diana the full screen.
Okay, so today I'll talk very briefly about climate change influences on groundwater availability in coastal BC. And I'm going to start off with answering the question, first of all, what is groundwater recharge? Because there's been a lot of interest in groundwater recharge from a water budget perspective. So groundwater recharge is the addition of water to the water table, and we measure that in millimeters per year. So there's two main types of recharge. One of them is diffuse recharge from precipitation, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. But there's also focused recharge that we can get from surface water bodies. So for example, streams or lakes that lose water to the groundwater system. So just in terms of the process, we have above the water table, so I'm showing the water table at the bottom of this column here, there's a soil zone sitting at the top that on the Gulf Islands is roughly a meter or so thick. And then underlying that, there would be sediment, or in the case of the Gulf Islands, Sunshine Coast bedrock. And all of this zone is unsaturated, meaning that the water is not fully filling the pores of the soil and the sediment. So when it rains, we end up with some of that water adding moisture to the soil zone. And there's also trees that might be taking up some of that water from the soil zone, and that water gets lost to evapotranspiration. Of the amount of water that does not get lost to evapotranspiration, it will percolate down and add recharge to the groundwater system. So it sounds like a very simple mechanism here, but it turns out that it's very difficult to estimate recharge because there are so many different factors that influence how much recharge occurs, when it occurs, and where it occurs. Some of these factors include climate, topography, vegetation, soil type, and geology. So just as a very simple illustration on the right, when precipitation lands on the ground surface, it partitions. So some of the water will go as overland flow or runoff. Some of the water, as I showed on that last slide, will be lost to evapotranspiration, either directly from the soil zone or from the trees and plants that are on the land surface. And whatever the balance is will infiltrate down and become part of that groundwater recharge. To the right here are two different kind of extreme scenarios for recharge and how much ultimately would get down into that groundwater system. And in the top example, we have a very steep slope. We have few trees on the ground surface, and we have fractured rock. So this would be quite similar to the type of terrain and geology that we have on the Gulf Islands. In that sort of situation, a lot of the water is actually lost to runoff. So that's shown by this very large arrow here. If you have, in contrast, sediments that are very highly permeable, topography is really flat, then very little runoff takes place, and a much greater proportion goes down to contribute to recharge to the groundwater system. So these are just two very simple end members of recharge. When we look at recharge, we use provincial observation wells to get an idea of how the water table varies over time. And here's a graph that shows precipitation as these bars on the bottom for different months of the year from 2013 to 2014, and the records for 3 observation wells on the Gulf Islands. So there's three things of interest here. One is that so our rainy season tends to be in the fall and early winter, and we notice that the groundwater levels rise up quite rapidly and they stabilize. They reach kind of a maximum level, and then once the rainy season ends, the groundwater levels start to drop off because there isn't any additional or any major precipitation happening during the late spring through the summer and into the fall. So this is a pattern that we see in groundwater levels across the region. And occasionally we'll see, if you had a very big rain event, we might see some spikes in that groundwater level. So the water gets into the system, but then the water also has to come out again. So there's three ways that water can come out of the groundwater system. So here's the first example where we have our infiltration going down into the bedrock. And as that water is added to the subsurface, the water table will rise up and groundwater will flow. Always flows from high elevation to low elevation areas. But in this situation, we're on a hill slope, and the water table during the time of the year where there's not a lot of precipitation ends up being intersecting the land surface down here. But during the rainy season, the water table intersects the land surface up here, and so we end up seeing seepage. And so groundwater is discharging along this slope. We also, in a coastal environment, so here's an example of an island, we have infiltration to the rocks, and groundwater flow will be discharging at an island scale out towards the coast. What's important about this situation is that this is seawater out here, this ocean water, and so underneath the island, or even a coastal aquifer, we have a freshwater lens. And this is the only available fresh water that we have on these islands. And there's a zone between the fresh water and the salt water that lies at depth underneath the island. So on an island, a good proportion of the water, groundwater that's discharging ends up out in the ocean. And this fresh water supports the marine ecosystems and maintains this freshwater lens under the island. And so if our recharge is decreasing and we reduce the amount of fresh water coming in, we will ultimately see this freshwater lens shrinking in size, and this interface between the freshwater and the saltwater moving inland. Finally, we have discharge to streams. So groundwater, if there are streams on an island, then you'll have some of the groundwater discharging into them. And this groundwater discharge provides the base flow to a stream. And often during the summertime, the base flow is the only flow that is occurring in that stream channel. In addition to that, groundwater is generally quite cool compared to surface waters during the summertime. So that cool groundwater discharging into the stream maintains or moderates the high temperature fluctuations that we see in stream conditions. Ultimately, any groundwater that we use, so by consuming it, consumption, will reduce the amount of discharge either to the ocean or to these streams. So how do we estimate recharge? Well, there have been a number of approaches taken for estimating recharge in the Gulf Islands. A lot of this work was done by my group, but we've tried so many different methods. And what I'm going to share with you today is the results from Gabriola Island, where we used a software package called Mike Shee to estimate the recharge. And it turned out it was roughly 20% of precipitation. The problem is that when we try to model or estimate recharge, we're usually using a very simple conceptualization of the subsurface. So our conceptual model kind of looks like this, with a bunch of grains and pore space in between, and that's the way the models are estimating recharge. But in reality, we've got fractured rock and we have water that's trying to get into individual fractures. So you might say, well, why use this simple conceptual idea rather than what the real situation would be like? And the problem is that the groundwater on the Gulf Islands is very complicated. We have different rock units in the subsurface. Those rock units have fractures and the water's flowing through the fractures. We have fracture zones where groundwater recharge might be concentrated and coming in. So it's a very difficult system to try and model even conceptually. We use this software called Mike Shee to do this. And I know it's a weird name, but anyway, this model does the entire watershed. So it looks at what is the climate going onto the land surface, what is running off, what is accumulating in lakes, what is getting in and infiltrating into the subsurface. So it's a fully integrated watershed model that we use to estimate recharge. And here are the results for Gabriola Island. So I'm showing mean annual. So over a period of, say, 10 years, what is the average annual recharge that occurs to Gabriola Island? Any of the red little pixels here are red and orange are showing seepage areas. So those hill slopes that I was talking about. And anything in the blue and green, those are the recharge areas. So on an average annual basis, there is a lot of recharge in this green that happens over the top of Gabriola Island, but there's also a lot of seepage areas along the sides. And then there's discharge to the ocean as well. Well, if we compare from year to year, which areas are always recharge areas and which areas are always seepage areas and which ones change between being seepage and recharge, we get this sort of a map here. And it's only these little purple areas that are functioning as recharge areas on Gabriola Island. So we end up with recharge not necessarily just being at high elevation where we might think it would be, but we get recharge happening in different areas across the island. And this pattern is not stable through the year. It changes through the year and it changes from year to year. And this is because of this water table rising and falling and where we have recharge and seepage areas. So how might climate change affect recharge? This is the big question. So we use global climate models or general circulation models to give us projections on how the climate might change. So I pulled these two graphs from PCIC, Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. And this is a graph, so this is for Gabriola Island, and this is showing the change in temperature into the future, so relative to 1981 to 2010, so that being the historical period. And all of these bars here, the orange ones represent the 2020s, which is where we are right now. The green ones represent the 2050s, and the red bars represent the 2080s. So you can see that quite obviously temperature is increasing consistently as we move into the future. Precipitation, though, sends a little bit of a different message. In the winter time, in the sort of January, February, and then November, December, there is an increase in precipitation, but throughout most of the rest of the year, there's a reduction in the amount of precipitation. So even though on average this region is supposed to get wetter, the amount of precipitation falling during the summer months is actually going to be reduced. The most important impact of that is that with the greater precipitation, which is shown in the green line here, so the blue line is for the 2050s and the green is for the 2080s, precipitation in the winter months and fall will increase, and most of that water is going to be lost to runoff, with very little of it contributing to new recharge. So more precipitation does not necessarily translate directly into more recharge. The other interesting question, though, is what if we have more heavy rain events? The heavier the rain event, the more runoff we get. And climate change projections suggest that our rain events are going to become a lot heavier. So we may get even less recharge taking place in the winter months. And likewise, what if we have summer droughts that last longer? Are the groundwater levels going to recover from that after a very long dry period? The last point here is salinization. So salinization of coastal aquifers, because of that ocean water body surrounding that freshwater lens, salinization is a really important process, and we can cause aquifers to become salinized due to groundwater pumping, but also due to overwash events. So if we start getting big storm surges, you can end up with water from the ocean overtopping the land surface, and then that salt water infiltrating down into the aquifers. And at the same time, sea level rise is supposed to happen, and so that will also push that salt water in towards the land surface. So this is Ganges on Salt Spring Island, showing areas where there's high hazard in red of salinization of the aquifers. So in summary, we have recharge areas that vary spatially and temporally. We have seepage in low elevation areas and at the base of steep topography. And recharge is roughly estimated at about 20% of precipitation on a long-term average annual basis. Future recharge increases in precipitation will mostly be in the form of increased runoff, and average recharge may increase by 10% over on an annual basis into the future. But you have to remember that the recharge is such a small percent of of how much water goes in anyway, that we might be talking about 20 millimeters a year more recharge, if that. And then finally, saltwater intrusion. These low-lying areas are at risk of storm surge, inundation, and sea level rise, both of which can lead to salinization. Thank you.